Our Bibles tonight are open to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. In this chapter, we're continuing our study through the letter of 1 Corinthians, this challenging letter that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. In chapter 9, Paul defends his apostleship. He defends some rights as an apostle. The conversation quickly turns into Paul talking about rights of a minister to be supported by the church. All of a sudden, I feel like Opie Taylor in an episode of the Andy Griffith Show. Opie had made friends with this young boy, Arnold. Arnold had taught Opie how to pitch a fit. That's really the only way to put it, to pitch a fit in order to get his way. Arnold was riding his bike on the sidewalks downtown, and he received a warning, and then ultimately Sheriff Taylor impounded Arnold's bike. Opie was at the courthouse. He was trying out this new idea of pitching a fit, this time in order to get out of doing his chores. It didn't work. That's when Arnold and his father came in. Arnold's father demanded that the sheriff give them back Arnold's bicycle. The sheriff explained that laws are on place for the safety of the citizens and for the safety of those in the community, and they had to be followed. And then the sheriff looked at the father and said, and perhaps if you don't understand that, maybe I ought to arrest you. Arnold got mad. He's ready to pitch his fit, and he said, "That's fine. Arrest my dad. He's not afraid. I want my bike back." And he begins to pitch a fit. The father's embarrassed. He turns to the sheriff and he says, "Sheriff, you can return that bike to me now." The sheriff said, "Come again?" He said, "Yeah, I'd like for you to return it to me so that I can sell it." Arnold continued to be upset. That's when Sheriff Taylor suggested to Arnold's father that he might want to use the nearest woodshed out behind the courthouse. The two, the father and son, left out. Opie looks at his paw and he says, "Pa, is Arnold going to get a spanking?" The sheriff said, well, Opie, don't you think he deserves one?" And that's when Opie said, "I don't want to say. After all, he is one of my own kind." That's how I feel tonight when we start talking about ministry and financial support of ministers and those that proclaim the gospel. I'm in very uncomfortable territory. I need you to understand that as we begin. I want to be true to the text tonight, and I'll tell you this. There are a lot of churches that need to hear what I have to say tonight. There are also a lot of ministers that need to hear what I have to say tonight. And so I hope to be balanced. I hope to be as balanced as I can in presenting the text of this chapter to us. Beginning in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul began to answer some questions that had been posed by the church. The first one dealt with marriage in chapter 7. In chapter 8, Paul addressed about food sacrificed to idols. Remember, this is the first time really that it starts coming into play of people claiming that they had the right to do this. But Paul had an interesting take on that in verse 9 where he says, "Be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak." He'd come back in verse 13 and really give his own personal counsel with that. He said, "Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall." It's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols. But what about these Christians? Perhaps a new Christian, young in the faith, perhaps someone that had really struggled with that sin to come out of that pagan worship. They become Christians and now they see their own brothers and sisters in Christ participating in the very activities that had held them captive to that pagan worship. Paul said, "I don't want to cause them to fall into sin. And if that's the case, I'm not going to eat that." Excellent, excellent point that the Apostle Paul makes there. Now, this week, like I said, we turn in chapter 9 where Paul somewhat diverts from the topic to talk about, well, he's still talking about rights, this time rights as an apostle. But when we get to chapter 10 next week, he will be more specific again on the very topics that we looked at in chapter 8. So as we come to chapter 9, let's get started. We've got 27 verses to look at tonight. I really want to just walk through the text. Beginning in chapter 9, verse 1. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. We see this in 1 Corinthians 9. We will see this in detail in 2 Corinthians, where Paul is having to defend his apostleship. As he does so in these first 3 verses, he points to 2 things. He said, first of all, that he had seen the risen Lord. If you'll remember back in Acts chapter 1, the apostles had to replace Judas. Judas had betrayed Jesus. It ultimately led to Judas taking his own life, and there was a spot that had to be filled. And as they were looking at criteria for that replacement apostle, Acts chapter 1 verse 22 tells us that it needed to be someone who had seen the risen Lord. And Paul declared, I have done that. He outlined that whole event in Acts chapter 9, Acts chapter 22, and Acts chapter 26 in very vivid detail. A second thing that Paul talked about with the church, he says that you are evidence of my apostleship. You, the church, the fact that you have come to Jesus, the fact that we are where we are today is proof. He said this, he said, you are the seal of my apostleship. Now, don't let that word slide by. It's an important word because a seal in that day spoke of genuineness, authenticity. It might be a seal on a piece of cargo. It says that this is the genuine article. It might be a seal on a letter, a legal document, but something that speaks to its genuineness and to its authenticity. And Paul said, church, that's what you provide for my apostleship. You are that seal for my apostleship. Then we come to chapter 9, verse 4. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Paul begins to speak here, and he's talking about this struggle that they are having. He says, shouldn't I have rights as an apostle, as one who proclaims the Word of God? Just looking at the rights that others have, he speaks of this. He says, I have the right to daily necessities. If I'm out proclaiming the gospel, wouldn't it seem logical that someone that is doing that would have the right to receive the support of daily necessities? Wouldn't it also, Paul said, I have the right to have a wife, to be married. If we remember in chapter 7, the evidence that we have for it suggests that Paul was not married. He said, but I have the right to be. I just choose not to be. He speaks about all the other apostles. He said, if that's the way these others are being treated, why would I be left out in the cold or left out in the dark? He said, we deserve the same rights as these others that are giving their life to proclaim the gospel, to go around to these various cities and communities to help establish His churches and congregations there. Chapter 7. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Now Paul goes and points to other areas, to other examples. He said a soldier. A soldier would not be expected, would not be required to provide his own rations. He said if someone that planted in a vineyard, it would be expected that he would be allowed to eat some of the grapes, some of the fruit of that vineyard. And then somebody that tends a flock, that he should be able to get some of the milk from that and be able to share in that as part of his work in that effort. Again, what's he pointing to? He's saying in all of these areas, whether it's the soldier, whether it's the one who plants the vineyard, whether it's the one who cares for a flock, they are able to receive support for what they do. What about the one who proclaims the gospel? Then in verse 8 he says, do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, this by the way from Deuteronomy chapter 25 verse 4, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, it was written for us, for whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so with the hope of sharing in the harvest. Now he's talking about a connection between a spiritual work and really a material harvest, of being able to receive this material support for the spiritual work that's done. Interesting story about that oxen, by the way. The oxen under the Old Testament law, when they were plowing ground, or when they were working on the threshing floor where the wheat was separated from the chaff, the oxen were not to be muzzled. In other words, if the oxen get hungry and they choose to eat some, let them eat. So Paul points to the Old Testament law, and he's saying, if that's how God cares about the oxen, the animals of the field, how do you think He cares about those and feels about those who are sharing the gospel? Verse 11, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? I think back to Jesus' parable of the sower, where He talks about scattering seed. He goes about scattering seed on all these different kinds of soil. And I know the application for Jesus is different, but the purpose of that is we plant seed longing for a harvest. A good harvest, 30, 60, 100 times what was sown. And Paul's saying if we're putting our hand to the plow to make sure that these things are happening spiritually, shouldn't we help take care of the ones who are leading that effort? Shouldn't we make sure that their physical needs, that material needs are being met while they are sharing the gospel and planting these seeds? Verse 12, if others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hindering the gospel of Christ. This is an interesting philosophy turn that Paul has made here. He said, others are getting it. He said, but you know what? Before I let this become an issue here, before us, we won't do that. We won't accept any of the help. He said, if it's going to hinder the cause of Christ, he said, because some of you, you're so adamant that there should not be support given. And I appreciate those of you that think that support should be given. But before we let this become an argument in the church, I don't want to hinder the cause of Christ and cause friction and division in the church. Verse 13, he comes back with another example. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is being offered at the altar? Under the Old Testament law, the sacrificial system, there were offerings and sacrifices that were brought. There were 5 different offerings. I know there was sin offering, guilt offering, grain offering, fellowship offering, burnt offering. And so you have these offerings and sacrifices that are brought. Everything that was brought was not burned on the altar, completely burned on the altar. A good bit of that was brought was to be taken, the meat was to be cooked and shared with the priest. Some of the things that were brought were to be put in storage, to be stored up, so that the Levites, this Levitical priestly tribe, might be able to care for itself. Remember, in the allotment of land, they did not receive any land. And so, in order for them to be about the business of taking care of the work at the tabernacle of God's house, they would receive a certain allotment, certain percentage of what was brought to the temple by the people. And the people were aware of that because it was clearly stated in the law. So Paul again brings up another example. Boy, we're on several examples by now, aren't we? And we've talked about a soldier, somebody who works in a vineyard, somebody who takes care of a flock, talked about the oxen, now you've talked about the priest being cared for at the temple. You have all of these examples Paul talks about of people in different areas, some of them spiritual areas, some not so, but all of them that receive this right to be supported for their work. Paul's saying, what about the person that's busy sharing the gospel and it is all he does? Verse 14, in the same way, the Lord has commanded those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I have not used any of those rights. And I am not writing this in hopes that you will do such things for me. I'd rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I'm simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. Paul says, I have the right. Ought to be the work of the church, that the church takes care of those who preach the gospel. But you know what? Apparently there must have been quite the fuss over this, because Paul says, I don't want any part of that. In fact, what I am doing now, he says, is I find my reward in seeing people respond to the preaching. I have to do this, he said, for the right reason. I have to do this because I am compelled to. It is in my heart. It is my motivation. It is my calling. It is what I have to do. And I appreciate what Paul's saying. I will tell you this as someone who has worked in full-time ministry for some 34 years now. I know how important it is to have the right attitude toward ministry. Being a minister, it has to be something that I want to do. And I'm just going to confess to you, church, the years of COVID were stressful on all of us for various reasons. And it really took its toll on me. I feel like I aged a lot more than 3 years in those 3 years. I could tell that a lot of things that used to be such a joy that I so looked forward to, that I just was so tired, that wasn't always the case. I've tried to work on that. I continue to try to work on that, because I have to tell you, I'm a work in progress. I'm always a work in progress, but particularly in this arena, I'm a work in progress because I want to, if I continue what I do, I have always said that the day that I lose the joy of this, that maybe it's time for me to step away. Maybe it's time for me to do something else. But deep down in my heart, I know what I want to do. And maybe that's more of a confession than you were prepared to hear tonight. I don't know. I hope to support and to encourage you. But I have to let you know that this last season, it's been a tough one. I'm not the only. So many preachers have even gotten out of the profession. They are doing something completely different. They were trained, they were gifted, they were good at what they did. But their hearts were broken, their spirits were broken, and to such a degree that they don't want to do this anymore. I pray some of them come back, but I don't know. I just don't know. More on that another day. Let's go to verse 19. This is when we get a good idea of Paul's perspective. I like this passage. Look at this. Though I am free and I belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those who were under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law. Though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all means possible I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. I love this passage. Now, do not misread this. Paul is not saying I'm a hypocrite, that I'm trying to be somebody. I'm not. That's not what Paul's saying. Paul is not trying to be a people pleaser. I'm just out here trying to please everybody I can. That's not what Paul said. What Paul said is, I desire to see people come to Jesus. And so I want to try to understand, to connect to them where they are, whether they are Jew, whether they are Gentile, whether they are strong, whether they are weak. Wherever they are, I want to meet them there and lead them to Christ. Oh, church. We could hear some of what Paul has to say. We meet them where they are so that we might lead them to Christ. Paul has already said in this letter, he's already talked about the fact that he says, you know what? You can't separate yourself from the world. He said, if you separate yourself from the world, how are you going to lead them to Christ? We have to meet people where they are and then lead them to Christ. That means we have conviction. And I'll have to tell you, the ability and the willingness that Paul had to meet different people where they were in their life and then lead them to Christ, that says so much about his heart, about his knowledge, about his passion, about his willingness to say no to temptation at all levels, to win as many as possible. Let's close out the chapter with some of the more famous verses from the chapter. Verses 24 through 27. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Oh, what a powerful passage. Now, when Paul started talking about this idea, this analogy of running a race, of competing in games, he was talking to the right group. The Corinthians understood that. When we think back of ancient games, we think back to the Olympics, still in play today. But Corinth held its own games, the Isthmian Games, and they were quite popular. So the people may not have been the runners or the competitors in the contest, but they understood the process. They understood the process of what it meant to plan and to train and to be disciplined to work toward that goal. I think about the idea of right now, I'm still in the middle of this 100 days of summer trying to lose weight. A little bit of success at that. But you know, there are times that if I'm going to meet that goal, I have to say no to some things that I really love. I have to say no to that. Paul, I think, is challenging the church here. I think he's challenging the church. He said, man, you guys got to understand. Building off what he's just said, he said, you know, we're getting easily led off target. But we need to focus back on what the real issue is. And the real issue is leading people to Christ. The real issue is winning as many as possible. And we want to make sure that we're living lives in such a way that we will not be disqualified for the prize. That's why we make sure that we are living in a way that honors God and that is a positive influence to other people. If we're no longer a good influence on other people because we've been so busy wanting to exercise our own rights or start some fuss in the church, guess what? Nobody wants to hear what we have to say about Jesus. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to, he said, you know the last thing I want to do? He said, the last thing I want to do is to be this dedicated to preaching and to trying to see people come to Jesus, only to find out that I've disqualified myself for the prize. Paul says, I don't want to miss heaven. I don't want to miss the prize, the reward of seeing others accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. Keep our eye on the prize. Understand it takes training. It takes discipline. But our goal in this race of life, is to share the gospel so that we might claim the prize of heaven and take as many with us, as many as possible.